The millionaire hadn't heard his son's voice for years. Many believed the boy was mute. But everything changes when a humble new babysitter enters their lives. One afternoon, arriving home early from work, the millionaire freezes upon hearing something impossible. His babysitter talking with the little boy, and when he discovers the real reason why his son never opened up, his heart simply stops from shock. The air in the penthouse apartment on the 30th floor of the Upper East Side building was cold, filtered, and sterile, like the inside of a vault where something precious and fragile was kept. Richard, wrapped in an impeccably tailored suit that cost more than most people's cars, adjusted the expensive watch on his wrist, an automatic gesture he used to measure time and, in a way, the world. His eyes, accustomed to analyzing stock market charts and identifying weaknesses in multi-million-dollar negotiations, landed on the woman standing before him. This was Lucia, the new caregiver. Simple, in a modest fabric dress and worn-down flats, she looked like a bird from another landscape that had landed by mistake in this cage of glass and steel. He scanned her from head to toe, a quick, cold analysis, the same he'd give a balance sheet before making a decision. His objective was to maintain distance, establish the rules, ensure this new piece in the machinery of his life would function without friction. He pointed to the boy in the wheelchair, positioned before the immense glass wall that displayed New York City as a carpet of lights and concrete. This is Leo. His routine is rigid and detailed in the folder I left on the table. Medication schedules, physical therapy, meals, everything must be followed to the letter. He doesn't speak. The last sentence came out like a decree, an immutable fact carved in stone. But Lucia didn't look at the folder, nor at him. Her eyes, a deep and serene brown, met the boy's, who kept his face turned to the window, pretending not to notice anyone's presence. Richard felt a prick of irritation. She wasn't following protocol. He was a man whose fortune was measured in digits most people couldn't even count. A multimillionaire whose net worth grew with the same regularity as the sunrise, and he was used to being obeyed. She, however, ignored him. With a delicacy that surprised him, Lucia bypassed the leather armchair where he sat and approached the wheelchair. Her hands didn't touch the boy, but they rested gently on the cold metal backrest. Then, in a fluid and respectful motion, she knelt, bending her knees until her face was exactly at Leo's level. The boy turned his head minimally, an almost imperceptible movement, but his eyes met hers. The silence in the room was dense, broken only by the distant hum of traffic below. And then, with a voice as low and soft as velvet, Lucia said something that defied all of Richard's business logic, his entire structure of command and control. "I can hear you without words." He feigned indifference, turning to pick up his briefcase, the Italian leather cool beneath his fingers. But her sentence hung in the air, reverberating like an ancient bell echoing through a silent valley. An offer, not an order, a connection, not a transaction. As he left for work, ready for another day of decisions that would move capital and alter the course of major corporations, he felt something unusual. His heart, shielded for years by the pressure of the financial market and the memory of an old, painful loss, beat in a strange, arrhythmic tempo. It was a glitch in the system, an anomaly he didn't know how to analyze, a disruption in his emotional cash flow that left him, for the first time in a long time, completely disoriented. Atop the skyscraper on Wall Street, Richard commanded his reality. The boardroom was a fishbowl of power, where men in equally expensive suits spoke of interest rates, dividends, and the fluctuation of cryptocurrencies as if discussing the weather. He was the master of this universe. With a word, he could move millions of dollars, direct investment funds, and turn a company's assets into dust or gold. Today, the profit from one of his acquisitions had surpassed all projections, a feat that should have brought him the usual cold, calculated satisfaction. However, A simple sentence, spoken by a woman in worn-out flats, was creating interference in his system. "I can hear you without words." It was an anomalous piece of data, a variable that didn't fit on any spreadsheet. While his partner presented charts on the profitability of new stocks, Richard's mind drifted. He saw Lucia kneeling on the same level as his son, offering something his vast capital couldn't buy. Back in the apartment, Lucia felt the weight of the silence and luxury. The place was impeccable, but soulless. There wasn't a crooked picture frame, a book out of place, a sign of disordered life. It was a catalogue, not a home. Leo remained in the same position, a small sentinel watching over a city he couldn't touch. She didn't force an approach. She started by tidying the kitchen, humming an old folk song from her childhood in Appalachia, a lullaby her grandmother used to sing to calm fears. From her simple bag, she took out her instruments, very different from the high-tech gadgets she saw scattered around the house. A blue-covered notebook, plain and unlined, and a glass jar filled with seashells, small and of varied colors. She placed the jar on the coffee table, close enough for Leo to see. She said nothing. The boy turned his face for a moment, his eyes fixed on the strange objects. Lucia sat on the rug, at a respectful distance, and opened the notebook. With a pencil, she began to draw. A smiling sun, a tree with a swing. Simple, childlike strokes. Leo watched her from the corner of his eye. Time crawled by, measured not by the expensive clock on the wall, but by the changing light outside. The smell of cleaning products was replaced by the warm, welcoming aroma of chocolate chip cookies she decided to bake. She cracked open a window, letting real air in, bringing with it the muffled sound of the city. Richard ended his day early. The victory in business felt empty. A restlessness pushed him home, an impulse he didn't bother to analyze. As he turned the key in the electronic lock, he was greeted not by the usual cold silence, but by a warmth and a smell that transported him to a forgotten time. Chamomile tea and freshly baked cookies. His mother used to make them. He stopped in the hallway, his heart beating erratically again. From the living room came a low sound, a contained sob. He quickened his pace, his mind flooded with a cold panic. He found Lucia kneeling on the floor, exactly as he had left her. But now Leo had his face in his hands, his small body shaken by convulsive crying. It wasn't a cry of physical pain, but of something much deeper, a dam breaking. Richard froze at the entrance to the room, a statue in a suit and tie, powerless. He was about to shout, to demand an explanation, but then, through the sound of weeping, a voice emerged, a hoarse whisper, fragile as a dry leaf, a voice he hadn't heard in 2 years. Words at school, they hurt. Richard's world, a solid structure built on the cold logic of numbers, compound interest, and return on investment, collapsed. The 2 words whispered by his son were more impactful than any sudden drop in the stock market. Words hurt. It was a liability he had never calculated, an emotional debt accumulating silently under his own roof. He took a step forward, his expensive Italian shoe making a dull sound on the hardwood floor. His first reaction was that of an executive. Analyze, quantify, solve. But how do you solve a pain that has no price? How do you measure the loss of a wounded child's soul? Lucia, sensing the storm of emotions forming in his eyes, acted with the same serenity as before. She didn't stand up, but turned the blue-covered notebook so he could see. On the page was a drawing with trembling, childlike lines, a figure in a wheelchair, isolated in the corner of a playground. Around it, other stick figures with mouths open in cruel O's. Below, a sentence scrawled with effort, "You can't play." Guilt hit Richard like a physical force, knocking the wind out of him. He had given his son the best education his money could buy, an elite school whose tuition was equivalent to a small investment, but he had failed to see what was essential. He had been too busy growing his portfolio, diversifying his assets among gold, stocks, and even crypto, to notice that the most precious asset of his life was being depleted. Lucia finally rose, her knees marked by the time she'd spent on the floor. He didn't need a translator, Mr. Grant. He just needed a bridge, she said, her voice soft. The shells, the sound of the ocean helps drown out the bad voices. The songs, music organizes feelings, and the gestures. She made a movement with her hands, a small choreography of courage, as she explained. Each sound associated with a gesture, turning the act of speaking into something physical, controllable. He built a wall to protect himself. We just opened a small window. Richard looked from the woman to his son, who was now staring at him with red, moist eyes, a silent question hanging between them. The attraction he felt for Lucia deepened, but now it was tinged with fear. She saw what he didn't. She understood a language that he, the master of business and complex negotiations, was ignorant of. She was resilient, caring, but he sensed a strength in her, an invisible scar of someone who had fought other battles. And he, the controller, felt completely powerless. His instinct was to retake control in the only way he knew. You will be rewarded for this, a bonus. Whatever it takes, your salary will be tripled. It was an attempt to turn that sacred moment into an item on his cash flow statement, something that could be paid for and filed away. Lucia shook her head, a sad smile on her lips. I don't want your money, Mr. Grant. Her formality was a gentle barrier. In that moment, he understood the conflict brewing in his chest. Admitting he needed her, that he couldn't handle everything, was a personal bankruptcy he didn't know how to declare. Hers, he was beginning to suspect, was accepting any kind of care without feeling she had to pay for it with excruciating sacrifice. Anger, a more familiar and manageable feeling than guilt, began to bubble up. The school. They're going to hear from me. Tomorrow morning, I'm putting an end to this. The decision was made with the same speed he would sell falling stocks. Lucia placed herself between him and the door, her small body an unexpected barrier. No, please. If you go there like that, like a hurricane, you'll validate his fear. You'll teach him that the only answer is conflict. Leo needs a plan, not a battle. The word battle echoed in the lavish room, a term Richard understood perfectly. His life was a succession of battles, against competitors, against market volatility, against time. He won them with strategy, power, and a volume of money that crushed any obstacle. But the woman before him wasn't talking about business or capital. She was talking about a child. His shoulders, tense under the designer suit, relaxed minimally. He looked at Leo, who was watching them with an attention that seemed to weigh a ton. The boy wasn't just listening. He was gauging his father's reaction, searching for safety in his eyes. For the first time, Richard felt that his multi-millionaire armor was useless. Worse, it was a burden. He nodded, reluctantly. Fine, your way. For now, the concession cost him more than any high-risk investment. The next day, impatience gnawed at him. From his home office, with screens displaying stock quotes and the value of his assets in real time, he tried to work, but the numbers seemed blurry, insignificant. The only liability on his mind was his son's pain. Ignoring Lucia's advice, he picked up the phone. It wouldn't be a hurricane, it would be a surgery. Precise, cold, and assertive. He called the school's headmistress, a woman named Mrs. Albright, whose voice was as polished as the reputation of the institution she ran. Richard explained the situation calmly, omitting the most painful details, but making it clear there was a serious problem. Her response was a masterpiece of corporate deflection. Mr. Grant, I understand your concern. We deeply value your son and your family, who contribute so much to our community. But bullying is a very strong word. Sometimes children have difficulty integrating. Leo is a More introspective boy. Perhaps he's being a bit hypersensitive, she suggested, with a venomous sweetness that the problem might lie in Leo's perception, not in the actions of others. Richard felt his blood boil. He had poured a fortune into that school between tuition and generous donations, treating it as one of his best investments in his son's future. And now, the headmistress was protecting the institution's main asset, its impeccable image, by implying the victim was to blame. He hung up the phone before he said something that would destroy any bridge. The rage left him trembling. Lucia was right. He left the office and found her in the living room with Leo. The two were on the floor, putting together a jigsaw puzzle. The scene was so peaceful, it made the preceding conversation even more grotesque. "You were right," he said, his voice low and hoarse. The admission was like swallowing glass. Lucia looked up, and in her eyes there was no triumph, only compassion. "They will protect the school, not Leo. We need to show them what cannot be denied." She stood up and went to the boy's room. "I'll get his jacket. It's starting to get chilly." Richard followed her with his gaze. She moved with a quiet purpose, a tranquil strength that disarmed him. He heard her open the closet. There was a pause, a silence that stretched for a few seconds longer than normal. Then her voice, different, charged with a contained urgency. "Mr. Grant, come here, please." He entered the room. Lucia was crouched before the open closet. In her hands was not the jacket, but an old shoebox, hidden in the back, behind a pile of board games. Inside, dozens of crumpled sheets of paper. She took one out and handed it to him. The drawing was clearer, more desperate than the first. It showed a wheelchair being pushed down a flight of stairs by two larger figures. On another sheet, a large red X over the mouth of a boy who was unmistakably Leo. And then, on the third sheet, she showed him. A detail froze the blood in his veins. Next to one of the drawn aggressors, in a shaky, furious handwriting, was a name: Gabriel. The name Gabriel hung in the silent air of the room like a sentence. Richard knew that name. Gabriel was the son of one of his business colleagues, a man named Arthur, with whom he often closed deals involving the movement of significant capital. The revelation transformed the problem from an institutional issue to something dangerously personal. The business world, where he was king, and the world of his home, where he felt like a stranger, had violently collided. His instincts, sharpened at negotiation tables, screamed for him to act, confront Arthur, use his influence, his wealth, to crush the problem as he would a disloyal competitor. But then he looked at Lucia. She held the drawings with the care of someone handling evidence from a delicate crime. Her eyes conveyed not anger, but a deep sadness and an even deeper determination. She had found his son's hidden treasure of pain, the inheritance of suffering he had no idea was being accumulated. He saved all of this. He wanted someone to see, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. This changes things, doesn't it? Her plan, previously focused on caution, now gained a new urgency. She proposed a formal meeting at the school, but this time they would go prepared. Not with accusations, but with evidence. Speech therapy focused on trauma for Leo, so he could verbalize what he felt, and reaching out to other parents, discreetly, to see if there were other stories. Richard agreed, pride throbbing in his temples like a migraine. Asking for help, following someone else's plan, was like selling his shares at the lowest point in the market. The meeting was scheduled. Mrs. Albright received them in her impeccable office, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Beside her, the school psychologist, a woman who looked more like a public relations manager than a health professional. Richard presented the case, restrained and objective. As Lucia had instructed, he mentioned the drawings but didn't show them. He spoke of the traumatic mutism, Leo's suffering. The headmistress listened with an expression of false empathy. We understand your anguish, Mr. Grant. That's why we suggested that Leo participate in our social skills sessions. Perhaps he needs more tools to interact. The attempt to flip the script, to place the burden of adaptation on the victim, was so blatant that Richard had to clench his fists under the table to keep from exploding. Lucia intervened, her voice as calm as a stream. And what if the problem isn't his lack of tools, but the misuse of tools by other students? Children like Gabriel, for instance. Upon hearing the name, the headmistress and the psychologist exchanged a fleeting, almost imperceptible glance. But Lucia caught it. It was the confirmation they needed. Mrs. Albright quickly recomposed herself. Gabriel is one of our most popular students, a born leader. I think there's been a great misunderstanding. She dismissed the reports as fantasies of a sensitive child. The meeting was a calculated failure. They left with the certainty that the school would choose the path of denial. In the car, the silence was heavy. Richard felt defeated. His power, his fortune, seemed useless against a system designed for self-preservation. Leo, who had stayed in the apartment with the housekeeper, was sitting in the living room, waiting. When they entered, he looked at his father's face, searching for the verdict. Richard couldn't hide his frustration. The boy flinched, his shoulders shrinking, as if expecting another blow. He began to retreat into silence, the wall rebuilding itself brick by brick. But Lucia knelt before him, took his small hands, and looked into his eyes. We didn't lose, Leo. We just learned how they play. She waited, giving him time. And then something extraordinary happened. Leo took a deep breath, looked directly at his father, and with a firmness Richard had never heard, uttered a single word that contained all his pain and all his nascent strength. Enough. The word enough reverberated through the luxury apartment with the force of a declaration of independence. Richard felt a mixture of overwhelming pride and renewed fury. The raw emotion in his son's voice was a powerful fuel. His protective instinct, now allied with his nature as a ruthless executive, screamed for him to make the most drastic decision. Pull Leo out of that school immediately. Transfer his investment to a safer place with a higher emotional return. He could already visualize the scene, the withdrawal letter, the harsh conversation with the school board, the demonstration that his wealth funded, but was not subjugated by, any institution. It would be quick, clean, a loss-cutting operation. He turned to Lucia, ready to announce his decree, but she shook her head gently, anticipating his thoughts. If we pull him out now, he'll feel like he's running away, she argued, her voice low and persuasive. He said enough to the pain, not to the fight. We need to honor his courage, prepare him for a change, yes, but without reinforcing the feeling that he's the piece that needs to be removed. Richard stared at her, the internal conflict etched on his face. Her logic was irrefutable, but it went against all his impulses. He was a man who had built an empire by acting, not waiting. Meanwhile, a new character entered the scene, slinking in like a shadow. Patricia, an ex-partner of Richard's, heard about the situation through mutual acquaintances in New York's affluent circles. She was an elegant woman, with the same patina of wealth that coated everything around Richard, but with her own agenda. Patricia reappeared offering help, her voice on the phone layered with artificial concern. "Rich, darling, I heard about little Leo. How dreadful. You know you can count on me. I have connections on the school board. I can help smooth things over, avoid a scandal." The word scandal was the bait. Richard, worried about the impact the case could have on his business and his family's image, almost gave in. Patricia's proposal was the quick, silent solution he so craved. But Lucia, who overheard the tone of the conversation, warned him discreetly, "Smoothing things over protects the school, not Leo." He refused Patricia's offer, thanking her with polished coldness. The rejection, however, planted a dangerous seed. Patricia was not a woman who took no for an answer. She saw Lucia as a threat, a piece out of place on the social chessboard she dominated. She began to spread rumors, little drops of venom whispered at dinners and charity events. Poor Richard, so vulnerable. It seems this new caregiver, a simple girl from the country source, is taking advantage of the situation. They say she's manipulating the boy to get ahead. The gossip, like a virus, spread through the parent group of the elite school, creating a convenient narrative. The caregiver was the villain, a social climber who had invented a bullying story to get close to a billionaire. Lucia's reputation was beginning to be undermined, and with it, the credibility of the accusations. Oblivious to this, Lucia focused on strengthening Leo. The weeks moved on, and the city changed color, from the damp gray of July to a fragile gold that broke through the August clouds. Each of Leo's small victories came at a cost. To get him to form short sentences again, Lucia took him to an inclusive drum circle in a park near her neighborhood, a world away from the walls of the Upper East Side. There, to the sound of the djembe, Leo felt the vibration of the music in his chest. He smiled, a genuine, wide smile, and clapped his hands to the rhythm. Richard, to be there, cancelled a crucial dinner with foreign investors. The decision cost him a valuable contract, a loss of millions of dollars that his financial advisor lamented for days. But seeing his son smile, Richard felt a kind of profit that couldn't be measured in euros or dividends. It was on that day, in Central Park, while they watched Leo try some timid dance moves, that Patricia attacked. From a distance, using her phone's zoom, she took a picture. The image, cropped and out of context, showed Richard and Lucia side by side, smiling at each other while the boy had his back to them. The caption implied everything. "Looks like Richard's mourning period is over." That was fast, wasn't it? The photo was sent to the school's parent group chat. The ammunition the school needed to disqualify the complaint now had a face and a name: Lucia. The digital venom spread faster than any news of a stock market surge. The photo, shared and commented on with veiled cruelty, reached Richard's phone as a message from Arthur, Gabriel's father. It wasn't a direct accusation, but something much worse: false solidarity. "Richard, my friend, be careful. In our world, perception is everything. Mixing your personal affairs with your son's education could create a branding liability that's hard to reverse." The threat was clear. Wrapped in silk, reputation, his most valuable social asset, was at stake. His business partners didn't care about the truth, only the stability of their investments. A scandal was synonymous with risk, and risk was something to be eliminated. Richard felt a cold fury. He, who controlled fortunes, was being cornered by gossip. At home, Lucia discovered the firestorm in another way. The housekeeper, a woman who had worked for Richard for years and viewed the new caregiver with silent suspicion, left a tablet open in the kitchen. By accident, the screen showed the parent group chat, with the photo and a cascade of malicious comments. "I always suspected these women who come from nothing. She knows exactly what to do to hook a grieving billionaire. Poor boy, being used as bait." Each sentence was a stone. Lucia felt the air leave her lungs. It wasn't the lie that hurt her, but the cruel truth behind the tactic. They had turned her into the perfect weapon to invalidate Leo's pain. Her presence, which had been the key to opening the door of silence, was now the lock that would seal it again. An old pain, the scar from her childhood, tore open. She remembered the times she had stood in front of her younger siblings, taking the blame to protect them. She had learned early that to save those she loved, sometimes she had to disappear. When Richard arrived, the storm in his eyes met a desert of resignation in hers. "I'm going to sue them," he snarled, his phone in his hand like a weapon. I'll buy every blog that reported this and expose them all. It was his standard solution. Use power, money, to annihilate the problem. But Lucia shook her head, her decision already made. No, Richard, don't you see? If you do that, you'll just confirm their story. The powerful millionaire trying to silence the truth about his affair with the caregiver. Your son's story will be forgotten. He'll just be a detail in the gossip. She moved closer, and for the first time, the formal barrier between them dissolved, replaced by a shared vulnerability. I've become a liability. For them to believe Leo, I can't be here. Panic seized him. That's ridiculous. You're not going anywhere. I'll protect you. It's not about me, she said, her voice firm despite the pain. It's about him. I'm going to step away for a few days until the dust settles. It's the only way. He tried to argue, to offer a raise, a house, security, anything his money could buy. But she was adamant. Sacrifice was the only currency she knew to pay for the peace of others. The next day, her absence screamed from every corner of the apartment. The air conditioning resumed its cold, lonely hum. The apartment, which had gained the scent of brewed coffee and laughter, became barren again. Richard found Leo in the living room, facing the window, his body rigid in the wheelchair. The boy looked at his father, and his eyes were two closed windows. The progress, the voice, the light. It had all been extinguished. Desperate, Richard ran to Lucia's room. The bed was made. Her clothes were gone. On the nightstand, next to a single seashell, was a note. The handwriting was simple and direct. He needs to be the only story. Take care of him. I'll come back when the time is right. And suddenly, the man who commanded an empire of wealth and power felt like the poorest, most helpless man in the world, alone with the crushing silence of his son. The days that followed were a brutal lesson in the insolvency of money in the face of human pain. Richard tried to fill the void left by Lucia with what he had in abundance: resources. He hired the most renowned child psychologist in New York, a woman with an impeccable resume and fees that would represent the annual salary of many people. She arrived with a tablet, interactive apps, and a clinical approach that turned the living room into an office. Leo, however, remained impenetrable. He refused to touch the apps, to respond to the stimuli. His eyes remained fixed on the urban landscape beyond the glass, and in his small hand, he clutched the single shell Lucia had left behind, as if it contained the sound of the only ocean that could soothe him. The return on that expensive investment was zero. Richard, the man who turned capital into fortune, felt his most valuable asset, his son's recovery, depreciate with every silent hour. Frustration consumed him, turning into a dull, impotent rage. He paced the apartment like a caged animal, the expensive suit feeling like a ridiculous disguise for the failure he felt. The housekeeper prepared meals at the correct times. The physical therapist came and did her work with mechanical efficiency, but the soul of the home had left with Lucia. There was no more smell of cornbread, no low humming of folk songs. There was only order, luxury, and a crushing silence. One afternoon, upon entering Leo's room, Richard found him with the blue-covered notebook on his lap. He wasn't drawing. He was just running his fingers over the old drawings, the lines Lucia had made, as if trying to absorb the courage they once represented. Richard's heart broke. He tried to get closer, sat beside his son and said, his voice as soft as he could manage, "We're going to fix this, son, I promise." Leo didn't react. He just closed the notebook and turned to the window, raising the wall of silence higher than ever. Lucia's absence wasn't just an emotional problem. It was a strategic disaster, and the enemy sensed the breach in his defenses. The blow came in the form of an official email from the school. The tone was formal, cold, and relentless. "Dear Mr. Grant, in light of recent events and the need to preserve the well-being of our school community, we are calling an extraordinary meeting for the final clarification regarding your son, Leonardo's case. Your presence is mandatory." It wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. Richard understood the maneuver immediately. They were capitalizing on Lucia's absence and the gossip that had neutralized her. It would be a spectacle, a performance of orchestrated transparency to publicly absolve themselves. He would be the overprotective, emotionally unstable father, and Leo, the problem child. His arguments, without Lucia's serene strength to support them, and without Leo's voice to confirm them, would be nothing but the ravings of a rich man used to getting what he wants. The school, cornered and pressured, was about to deliver the checkmate, turning the meeting into a kangaroo court where he was already condemned. The email from the school glowed on the computer screen like an ultimatum. Richard's mind, trained for corporate warfare, instantly switched to defense mode. The first call was to his lawyer, a man who solved problems with contractual clauses and multi-million-dollar lawsuits. The second was to his PR agent, a specialist in turning image disasters into narratives of triumph. He planned the counter-offensive, mobilizing his army of expensive professionals. Treating the meeting like a hostile shareholder assembly, he would protect his assets, his reputation, his son in that order, his brain programmed by instinct. But as he hung up the phone, a profound silence in the apartment confronted him with the fallacy of his plan. What was the point of winning the war in the courts if he had already lost the peace at home? He went to Leo's room. The boy was sitting on the bed, the blue-covered notebook closed on his lap, the small seashell in his hand. He wasn't looking at the city outside, but at a fixed point on the wall, as if watching a movie only he could see. Richard sat on the edge of the bed. "Leo, we're going to the school. Can you show me the drawings again? Can you tell me what happened?" The question came out more like a plea. Leo didn't move. There was no answer. Only the silence, dense and heavy. In that moment, Richard felt the true measure of his poverty, his immense fortune, his investments spread across stocks, funds, and even foreign government bonds, his net worth that placed him among the richest men in the country. All of it was useless. He couldn't buy a single word, a single look of trust from his own son. The PR agent called back with a strategy: paint the school as incompetent, leak the story to a friendly journalist, create a controlled scandal that would cast them as victims. But Lucia's words echoed in his mind. "If you go there like that, like a hurricane, you'll validate his fear." He looked at the shell in his son's hand. It was such a simple object, with no monetary value. But it held a power that all his capital could not replicate. It was the key, and the key was with Lucia. The epiphany hit him with the force of a punch. He didn't need lawyers. He needed her. The only person who had translated Leo's silence, who had built a bridge over the abyss. Letting her go had been the worst deal of his life, a monumental miscalculation. He stood up, his decision made. He took the key to one of his less conspicuous cars. Still, a vehicle that screamed wealth, and dismissed his driver. He would drive himself. This was not a task to be delegated. It was a pilgrimage. He put Lucia's address into the GPS and plunged into the New York traffic, leaving his glass bubble on the Upper East Side and heading toward a borough he only knew from the map. The streets narrowed. The mirrored skyscrapers gave way to colorful row houses. The sound of horns mingled with loud music and the voices of children playing on the street. It was a world with texture, with smells, with life. He parked the car, feeling like an alien in his expensive suit. He found the building, a simple walk-up in Queens, with a fern hanging in the window and an air of dignity that humbled him. He walked to the door, his heart pounding erratically, a mix of hope and fear. He raised his hand to knock, but before his knuckles touched the wood, the door opened. An older woman with graying hair tied in a bun and the same expressive brown eyes as Lucia looked him over. She glanced at him, at the car on the street, and her face hardened into an expression of weary protection. "Yes?" she asked, her voice not hostile, but with a clear barrier. "What can I do for you?" Richard felt the weight of the woman's gaze. A silent appraisal that seemed to see right through his designer suit and his interest-bearing bank accounts. The barrier in her tone was more impenetrable than any boardroom. I'm Richard Grant, Leo's father. I need to speak with Lucia. It's urgent." His voice, accustomed to giving orders that moved millions in assets, came out almost as a plea. The woman, whom he assumed was Lucia's mother, didn't move. Her arms crossed over her chest. A defensive gesture he knew well from negotiation tables. "My daughter isn't working for you anymore, and from what I heard, her life became a living hell because of that job. So if you don't mind..." She began to close the door. Panic rose in Richard's throat. "Please," he said, his hand rising instinctively, stopping inches from the wood. "It's not about work. It's about my son." He stopped speaking again, completely. The mention of Leo made the woman hesitate. The hardness in her eyes softened for an instant, replaced by a spark of compassion. At that moment, Lucia appeared in the hallway behind her mother, drying her hands on a dish towel. Her eyes widened when she saw him there, at her door, an element from another universe. She was wearing simple sweatpants and a t-shirt, her hair tied back unceremoniously. She looked younger, more fragile, away from the sterile environment of his apartment. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low, a mix of surprise and apprehension. Her mother turned. "He was just leaving." "It's okay, Mom," Lucia said, approaching the door. She looked at Richard, and he saw the weariness of the past few days in her face. "You should go. You'll only make things worse." "Worse?" "Lucia, the school called a meeting. It's a trap. They're going to use your absence and the lies they spread to destroy us. To say that Leo is the problem, and I don't know what to do." The confession came out raw, stripped of all pride. "I've tried everything. I called the best psychologist, mobilized my PR agent. Nothing works. He just sits there all day holding that shell, staring at nothing." He took a step forward, his voice lowering to a desperate plea. "I didn't come here as your boss. I didn't come to offer money or a raise, or anything my stupid fortune can buy. I came to ask for help, not for me, for him. He needs you. I don't know how to reach my son. You're the only one who ever did." Lucia's mother intervened, her voice protective. "They humiliated my daughter. They dragged her name through the mud. You let that happen. Why should she go back to be a target again?" It was a fair accusation, and Richard had no defense. He looked at Lucia and saw the conflict in her face. The desire to help Leo fought against the instinct to protect herself. He knew she carried the scar of always having to sacrifice for others, and here he was, asking her to do it one more time. "I know," he said, his voice hoarse. "I was a coward. I should have seen it coming. I should have protected you. My focus was on protecting my portfolio, my business deals, when the only asset that truly matters was being silently destroyed. But I've learned, this time, it will be different. I will be by your side. We will be in this together." The word "together" hung in the air between them, charged with a meaning that went beyond the school meeting. It was an offer of partnership, of an alliance. Lucia glanced at her mother, who shook her head negatively, a silent warning. Then she looked back at Richard, her eyes searching for the truth in his. She saw a man stripped of his billionaire armor, a terrified father, a human being asking for help. He pulled his phone from his pocket, not to show a Bitcoin quote or the growth of his dividends, but to show the last photo he had taken of Leo that morning. The image of the boy in the wheelchair, his back to the world, holding the small shell to his ear, as if trying to hear an echo of hope that no longer existed. The photograph on the phone screen was more eloquent than any financial statement. It was the raw, naked image of a regression, irrefutable proof that Richard's strategy, power, money, and influence had failed. Lucia looked at the image of Leo, small and solitary in his fortress of silence, and felt a physical pain, a sharp pang in her chest. It was the ache of empathy, her greatest strength and her greatest vulnerability. Her mother, seeing the expression on her daughter's face, sighed. She knew that heart. "Lucia, think carefully. You don't owe this man anything." "I know, Mom. I don't owe him," Lucia replied, her eyes still on the phone. "But I owe Leo." She raised her face and met Richard's gaze, the decision solidifying in her eyes. There was no hesitation, only a calm resignation. "I'll go, but on one condition." Richard nodded, ready to accept any terms. "Anything. We're not going to the meeting to fight. We're not bringing lawyers or PR agents. We're bringing Leo. And we're bringing the blue-covered notebook." The simplicity of the condition caught him off guard. He had expected a financial demand, a contract, a security. She asked only for the tools they already had, the child and his truth. It was a plan so devoid of aggression, it seemed suicidal in the corporate world he came from, but he understood the genius behind its simplicity. They weren't going for a battle of narratives, but for a testimony. The day of the meeting arrived, charged with a palpable tension. The New York sky was gray and heavy, mirroring the mood inside the luxury car. Lucia sat in the back seat, next to Leo. She held his hand, which was cold as ice. The boy was trembling, his eyes fixed on the window, watching the buildings pass like menacing giants. He shrank into his chair with every mile that brought them closer to the school. Richard, at the wheel, watched the scene in the rearview mirror. His son's fear was a knife in his chest. The urge to turn back, to protect Leo by locking him in his ivory tower, was immense. But he looked at Lucia. She was whispering to the boy, not empty words of encouragement, but a calm description of what she saw outside, anchoring him in the present. At the school entrance, Leo's trembling intensified. He gripped Lucia's hand tightly, his body paralyzed. It was here, at this gateway, that the words hurt. Mrs. Albright was waiting for them in the lobby, her professional smile firmly in place. Beside her were Arthur and his wife, Gabriel's parents, their expressions a mixture of arrogance and concern. Other board members were present, forming a semicircle that looked like a firing squad. The conference room was the stage for the spectacle. Everyone sat around a long mahogany table. Richard placed the blue-covered notebook on the polished surface. The simple object looked out of place, almost sacred, amidst the sterile formality. The headmistress began her speech, a carefully rehearsed piece of oratory about the school's reputation, the importance of harmony, and misunderstandings that can arise in environments of intense social interaction. She was building the case to blame social media hysteria and the family's emotional instability. Leo kept his head down, his eyes fixed on the notebook. Richard felt the anger rise, but a look from Lucia held him back. The crucial moment arrived. Mrs. Albright turned to Leo with a calculated sweetness. "Leonardo, dear, we just want to understand. Can you tell us why you're so sad?" The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. The boy trembled, his knuckles white from gripping the chair. Arthur snorted impatiently. "This is ridiculous. We're wasting our time." It was then that Lucia leaned in and whispered something in Leo's ear, something only he could hear. She opened the blue notebook to a blank page. With a trembling hand, Leo picked up the pencil. He didn't look at anyone. He began to draw the school playground. He drew the stick figures, the mouths in cruel O's. And then, in a crooked, faltering hand, he wrote the name, Gabriel, and then the name of another boy, and another. Finally, he lifted his head. He didn't look at the headmistress or the other parents. He looked directly at Richard, his safe harbor, his father, and with the loudest, clearest voice anyone in that room had ever heard him use, he said, each word a victory, a conquest. "I need to be heard." The silence in the conference room was so absolute you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Leo's words, "I need to be heard," were not a shout, but a seismic force that cracked the foundation of lies and evasions in that room. The color drained from Mrs. Albright's face, her professional composure dissolving like wet paper. Arthur, Gabriel's father, opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came out. For the first time, the wealth and influence that filled that room were silenced by the truth of a child. Richard looked at his son and felt a wave of emotion so strong it made him dizzy, a fierce pride mixed with a deep ache for all the time he himself had not known how to listen. Then, something unexpected broke the spell. A woman sitting in the corner, the mother of one of Leo's classmates, stood up. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "He's right," she said, looking not at the headmistress, but at the other parents. "My son told me about the names, about how they would isolate Leo at recess. I thought it was just kids being kids. I regret not taking it seriously." It was as if a small crack had opened a dam. Another mother, sitting next to Arthur, added in a low voice, "My daughter said that Gabriel and his friends would take Leo's lunch and throw it in the trash. She was afraid to tell." Voice after voice, the small confessions emerged, painting a devastating picture of daily cruelty that the school had worked so hard to conceal. Mrs. Albright had completely lost control of the narrative. Cornered, she stammered empty promises. We will take immediate action. Psychological support for all involved. A parent committee will be formed. It was the standard damage control script, but no one in the room believed it anymore. The victory seemed complete. However, behind the scenes, the gears of power continued to turn. On the way home, as Leo slept in the back seat, exhausted but visibly lighter, Richard's phone vibrated. It was his PR agent. "Richard, the story is leaking." One of the parents from the meeting spoke to a reporter. "If this blows up, your investors are going to get nervous. I've already had 2 calls from major players wanting to know what kind of instability is surrounding your name. A family scandal can affect the risk perception of your businesses. The market hates drama. We need to kill this now." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. He looked in the rearview mirror at his son's sleeping face, and then at the concrete landscape of New York. He had won the battle for Leo's voice, but the war for his financial empire was just beginning. He wavered. His entire life, he had been programmed to protect his capital, to cut losses, to manage crises. A part of him, the calculating billionaire, screamed at him to retreat, to accept the school's palliative measures and let the dust settle. Lucia, sitting beside him, watched him in silence. She hadn't heard the conversation, but she saw the change in his face. She saw his jaw tighten, his eyes narrow as he processed the new threat. She saw the conflict between the father who had just witnessed a miracle and the magnate who was calculating the damages to his net worth. And in her silence, she felt a familiar, painful resignation. History was repeating itself. In the end, there was always something bigger to protect. A fortune, an image, an empire, and she, the small, replaceable piece, would be the first to be sacrificed on the altar of big business. When they arrived at the apartment, Richard was still on the phone, speaking in code about damage mitigation and narrative control. Lucia took Leo to his room. When she returned to the living room, she found Richard with his back to her, looking out at the city, the phone still in his hand like a scepter. She stopped at a safe distance, the bridge they had built that afternoon dissolving in real time. "I understand," she said, her voice so low it was almost a thought. He turned, surprised. "Understand what? You have a lot to lose. A fortune, businesses, a name. I've seen it before, Richard. When the bill comes, someone always has to pay, and it's never the one hosting the banquet." He opened his mouth to deny it, to say she was wrong, that this time would be different, but his hesitation, the split second in which he weighed his son against his billions, had already said everything, and in her eyes he saw not anger or accusation, but something much worse, the confirmation of a truth she had carried her whole life, and with that she turned and walked toward her room, leaving him alone in the middle of the sumptuous living room, with a victory that suddenly felt like the bitterest of defeats. The night that followed was one of the longest of Richard's life. The apartment, the stage for such a significant victory hours earlier, became an echo chamber for his doubts. He didn't sleep. He spent the night in his office, the stock tickers flashing values that rose and fell, a ballet of numbers that had always fascinated him but now seemed hollow and meaningless. The profit from his stocks, the dividends from his funds, the appreciation of his gold and crypto, it all formed a mountain of wealth that isolated him, that kept him from breathing the same air as his son. He remembered the look on Lucia's face. It wasn't disappointment, it was recognition. She saw him not as Leo's father, but as just another powerful man choosing power over love. The realization hit him with the force of a revelation. In trying to protect his empire, he was actually hiding in it. The work, the fortune, the obsession with more assets and higher returns weren't a means to protect his family, but an end in themselves, a hiding place for his own inadequacy as a father, as a man. The fear of failing Leo had turned him into an expert at failing in more sophisticated and socially acceptable ways. At dawn, a new anonymous message flashed on the tablet the school had given Leo. It was an emoji of a wheelchair next to an emoji of a zipped mouth and the word shh. Leo, who had woken up lighter and smiling, saw the message. The color drained from his face. He let out a sharp cry, a sound of pure panic, and began to shake uncontrollably, his arms flailing, his eyes wide with terror. The panic attack was violent and frightening. Richard ran to the room and found his son in a state of emotional, not physical, convulsion. He tried to hug him, but Leo pushed him away, his body rigid with fear. It was the breaking point, the collapse. The moment when protective instinct finally crushed market politics. In that instant, Richard saw with crystal clarity that no contract, no investment, no net worth was worth more than his son's peace of mind. He picked up the phone and called his PR agent. "Cancel everything, we're not killing anything, and you're fired." Before the man could protest, he hung up. He ran to Lucia's room and knocked on the door. "Lucia, please. Leo, he's having a crisis. I don't know what to do." She opened the door, her face creased with sleep and concern. Seeing Richard's state and hearing the boy's terrified sobs, she didn't hesitate. She ran to the room and knelt beside Leo, speaking to him in a calm, rhythmic voice, like the sound of ocean waves. Gradually, the boy's breathing began to regulate. It was then that the city, once a backdrop of pressure and concrete, offered a respite. That night was the practice for the neighborhood high school's drum line. She had an idea. "Get him out of here. Take him somewhere the sound is louder than the fear." Richard didn't question it. They went downstairs, and for the first time, the Upper East Side millionaire entered the beating heart of a community he never knew existed. In the school's practice yard, the noise was deafening and wonderful. The bass drums of the drumline pounded like a giant heart, a vibration that pulsed through your chest and seemed to reorder your molecules. Leo, in his wheelchair, stopped trembling. His eyes, once wide with panic, were now fixed on the young men and women playing with contagious joy. The beat enveloped him like a hug. And then he clapped, offbeat at first, then finding the cadence. And when the drum major blew the whistle and the snares answered with a thunderous roll, Leo opened his mouth and dared to shout along. At that moment, watching his son immersed in the pure, visceral joy of the music, Richard understood. He made his final decision. He took out his phone and, right there amidst the pounding drums, he drafted a statement. He announced he was withdrawing his son from the elite school and at the same time that his primary investment foundation would sponsor a new sports and arts inclusion project for children with disabilities, starting in that very community. It was a declaration of war on the world he inhabited and a declaration of love for his son. Patricia, his ex, lost her stage. The school lost its scapegoat and its main donor. The business partners who had threatened him backed off. Fearing the negative press, Lucia watched him, and in her eyes, for the first time, there was not resignation, but a glimmer of admiration and surprise. He hadn't just made a choice, he had transformed. Leo's new school didn't have imposing iron gates or a mirrored glass facade. It was a public school in Lucia's neighborhood, with walls brightened by local graffiti artists and a playground that smelled of cornbread and happiness. In the middle of September, they organized a last-minute fall festival to welcome new students. Colorful banners danced in the wind, and the sound of a fiddle mixed with the laughter of children. Leo, in a plaid shirt Lucia had helped him pick out, was greeted by a class that, as part of the inclusion curriculum, was learning ASL. His welcome was given with hands, a ballet of gestures that said, "Welcome," in a universal language of acceptance. Richard watched from a distance, his heart peaceful for the first time in years. In his therapy sessions, he had finally admitted aloud that his obsession with growing his net worth was a shield. He confused protection with control, and work was his hiding place from dealing with the pain of loss and the fear of being an inadequate father. Now, seeing Leo smile as a classmate taught him the sign for friend, Richard understood that his true wealth wasn't stored in Swiss banks or high-yield investments, but right there in that noisy, happy schoolyard. Lucia had also found her center. She enrolled in a teaching program, determined to turn her intuition into a profession. She was still there, beside Richard and Leo, but not out of obligation or sacrifice. She was there by choice, a choice that stemmed from her own well-being, from the certainty that she deserved to be loved without having to erase herself to fit into someone else's life. One evening, on the apartment's terrace, New York City stretched out below them like a sea of lights. Lucia brought out the seashells. Leo picked one up, held it to his ear, and smiled. He looked at his father, his eyes shining. "Do you know what the first word I practiced with Lucia was?" he asked, his voice steady and without hesitation. Richard shook his head, curious. Leo brought the shell to Lucia's lips, like a microphone. She smiled and whispered, "It was the most important word." Then the boy turned to Richard, took a deep breath, and said, with a clarity that carried the full weight of their journey, "Dad." I would repeat "Dad" to the sound of the ocean, so I wouldn't be afraid. The man broke down. The steel armor he had built over a lifetime dissolved into silent tears. He hugged his son, and over his shoulder, his eyes met Lucia's. He didn't need words. He asked for forgiveness, for partnership, for a future. He offered no contracts or assets. He offered presence. The resolution finally came on a golden afternoon in the park. The inclusion project, sponsored by Richard, was coming to life on the playground, with music, dance, and conversation circles. Leo, now an active participant, was telling a story to a group of children, gesturing with enthusiasm. Richard and Lucia watched him, sitting on a bench. The silence between them was comfortable, companionable. Then Leo looked at them, grinned, and shouted, laughing, "Now I can say that I want you both around." With the blessing given, Richard turned to Lucia. With a gentleness he didn't know he possessed, he touched her face and kissed her. A tentative, soft kiss that sealed not a sweeping passion, but a solid construction of respect and admiration. There were no miracles. There were still judgmental looks and bureaucratic hurdles. But the family they had chosen had learned that a voice, when it finds courage and support, becomes a song. And New York, once a backdrop of concrete and haste, had become the stage for a love that had taught them the simplest and most difficult word: together.